hopefully something will come. It's a big blow actually.
Yeah, I know. Now, how many years has he been with us?
Since mid 80s actually. So
I think, folks, you're now live on Facebook. Huh? So you can.
Yeah, I was just going to
all this
intervene.
very open.
we can't wash our CPR dirty linen anymore.
And, thank you all for joining. And we shall start. Tanya, you may come in now. If all our speakers are ready, we can begin.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Tanya, you may come in.
All right. Good evening and welcome everyone to the Bridge Project and Center for Policy Research's webinar on bridging the gap between theory and practice, experiences from India. We will wait for a couple more minutes to begin the session. It's not 4 p.m. yet, so for about 5 to 6 more minutes.
You can begin, go ahead.
Okay, all right. So the Bridge Project is a student-led initiative that seeks to bridge the widening gap between academia and policymaking in India in the fields of international relations and public policy. We are a team of dynamic and passionate individuals dedicated to capacity building and research with the mission to improve the ecosystem of learning and skilling in India. Currently, we run a podcast series featuring scholars and practitioners from the fields of IR and public policy that is really available on all major podcast mediums such as Spotify, Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, etc. Ever wondered why the theories we learn in classrooms are seldom helpful in real-world policy making? What explains the lack of academic research in the framing of certain policies? Is there a way to bridge the two? The Bridge Project seeks to address this problem. The objective of this webinar is to bring together leading minds who would help us piece together their experiences of the policy-academia divide in their respective fields. Ambassador Kishan Rana is a Professor Emeritus at DiploFoundation. He was Ambassador and High Commissioner for Algeria, Czechoslovakia, Kenya, Mauritius, and Germany, and Consul General in San Francisco. Ambassador Sham Saran is a former Foreign Secretary and currently a Senior Fellow at CPR. He has served as the Prime Minister's Special Envoy for Nuclear Affairs and Climate Change, Chairman of the National Security Advisory Board, and Chairman of the Research and Information System for Developing Countries. Nayan Chanda is currently an Associate Professor in the Department of International Relations at Ashoka University and was the founding editor-in-chief of the Yale Global Online, published in 2002. Yamini Aiyar is the President and Chief Executive of CPR. In 2008, Ms. Aiyar founded the Accountability Initiative at CPR. Under her leadership, the Accountability Initiative has produced significant research in the areas of governance, state capacity, and social policy. Before we begin, as a kind reminder, I request everyone to mute their microphones. As for the Q&A session, you are requested to type your questions via Zoom chat box or Facebook Live, mentioning your name and institutional affiliation. Now, without much ado, I request Ambassador Kishan Rana to take over the discussion, please.
Thank you very much, Tanya. Friends, this particular initiative by the Bridge Project is particularly apt because the Bridge Project itself is an effort by students, by young people, researchers and others to bridge the gap between policy making and practice in diverse areas, particularly relating to different policy fields, but also covering international affairs. So in our conversation today, we have three eminent personalities. Ambassador Sham Saran, Foreign Service colleague. We've known each other for a very long time. And Sham brings a wealth of personal knowledge and experience across a very, very wide spectrum. Professor Nayan Chanda, is an eminent researcher, has published books, and is a known name in the field of international affairs. He was at Yale University for 15 years and has now shifted back to India. Dr. Yamini Aiyar is another very well-known name, and she is the chief executive of CPR, which is arguably perhaps India's finest think tank in not just in foreign affairs, but again in a broad spectrum of activities. And Sham, in fact, is closely associated with CPR and is a former chairman of the board of CPR. So I plan to conduct today's proceedings in the shape of a conversation. There are some questions which have been framed by our friends at the Bridge Project, and I will spice them up a little bit the best way I can. And I hope we will have interesting, short comments, observations from the three members of the panel. We will continue this conversation and explore a series of different ideas. And then at the end of some 40 minutes or so, we will open up the conversation to the many people who are participants, who are both on the Zoom platform as well as on Facebook, I understand. So let me start with Ambassador Sham Saran and put to him a question under the broad rubric of the government as a stakeholder. How should a government help in bridging this perceived gap, this distance between policy making and theory, or theory and practice, however we want to put it? Governments fund think tanks and other institutes. They give contract assignments. The governments now take in scholars from academia, as say in MEA, the Policy Planning Division has a number of researchers who help it, a dozen or so, maybe even more. Governments sponsor exchanges, and this links up also a little bit with the question of opening of archives. Now, I should add that it was during the time when Sham was Foreign Secretary that the Public Diplomacy Division was established. Is that correct, Sham? And I remember you're telling me that you had accepted one of my suggestions that I had ventured to put forward to you on that. So that was an act of, shall we say, expanded public engagement. Sham, what are your comments on this large question of the government as a stakeholder?
Thank you very much, Ambassador Rana. Let me, at the outset, thank the Bridge Project and the Center for Policy Research for organizing this very interesting and I hope a productive conversation amongst both practitioners as well as academics. Let me just clarify, Ambassador Rana, that I was never chairman of the CPR. I have been a member of their governing board. So Yamini Aiyar is my boss in a sense. Now, the question that you have asked, let me just try to give you a sense of my own experience, because I have been a practitioner like you, but you recall that afterwards I became also chairman of the Research and Information System for Developing Countries, where most of the work was academic work, research work. Now, the experience that I have is that, one of the reasons why perhaps there is this sense of disconnect is that even when the governmental system is actually utilizing a lot of the output from the academic side, it is not always apparent outside that in fact those outcomes have become part and parcel of the decision-making process, because the value of academic work as far as the academics are concerned, it would be how much actually the work that they have done has gone into the process of decision, because ultimately that's what is perhaps the value of academic research. And what I have found is that in very large number of cases, actually much of that work that is being done is utilized. But, it is not the habit of governments to say, or give credit to think tanks or to academics, hey, I have utilized what you have given us. So I think there should be perhaps a little more sense of reassurance that the government system actually does utilize, does value what is coming from the academic side. I think the problem is more on the reverse traffic. That is the government opening itself out. You mentioned, for example, the archives. Recognizing that the academic world can do a much better job if it had access to information, if it had access to the policy papers or the dispatches that you and I would have been sending to the government from our respective posts, because it becomes a very good template to actually test out your academic theories. I think that is what is perhaps lacking, that there is no system of the government opening itself out and opening its records out in order, in fact, to enable academics to do a better job in terms of their research. So that is an area which needs some work, I think, from our side. Let me also point out something which is perhaps a failing of governmental systems. Let me say that as far as my experience of diplomacy is concerned, you have to draw upon what I call a certain sort of knowledge system. There is a pool of knowledge from which you draw when you are making assessments, when you are deciding upon policy. And that knowledge system is very much contributed to, not by what is internally available within, say, the ministry, but, the wider field of academic research or, books that have been written. If I'm dealing with China, it is always very useful to see the larger, literature on China. There is a failing also when, for example, when we are looking at China, and you are aware of this in our work in the ICS, that it seems that you must focus only on foreign policy or you must focus only on security issues. In fact, you need a much broader canvas on which you need to understand the country that you are dealing with. So I think that orientation becomes very important.
Sham, if I may give you a quick follow-up question, would it help if there was a regular forum where senior personalities of, say, the External Affairs Ministry and a group of 12, 15 academics met once a quarter or so to exchange ideas? Because you're right, an academic would like to know how much their ideas, how much their scholarship goes into policy making. But sometimes they want to step beyond that. They also want a role in policy making. Now that, I'm afraid, is a bridge too far. That is not something that happens in any country. Any comment on that?
Yes, sir. As I mentioned that, again, I'm judging only by my experience, that it is not as if, the very valuable work which is done by academics is sort of not taken advantage of by policymakers or decision makers. It does form part and parcel of decision-making process. Sometimes less, sometimes more, but that depends sometimes on, what kind of personality you have, what kind of people you have. But I would say that it is not as if the contribution of academics is undervalued. Perhaps not. But yes, in terms of having somewhat more institutionalized kind of exchanges, even if it is very informal in nature, even if it is somehow closed door in nature, it happens episodically. It doesn't happen as an institutionalized mechanism. So yes, you are right. Maybe something like an institutionalized mechanism may be worthwhile. Let me remind you that when something like the Indian Council for World Affairs was set up, I think this is the kind of engagement that the decision makers at that time had in mind, that there would be an easy sort of traffic between government and the academic world.
Fair enough. I think these are good points. We'll come back to some of these. If I turn perhaps now to Professor Nayan Chanda, there is the question, and these are some questions that have been framed and put together by our friends at the Bridge Project. I may modify them a little, but these are really their ideas, and I want to thank them for that. There is the larger theme of reimagining the university space, the academic space. Are there now learning islands in the universities which are kind of a little bit isolated from others? Is that a challenge? What about interdisciplinary work? What about the curriculum in international relations? And that also connects with a theme that frankly bothers me quite a lot for many years now. And that in India, the area studies and language do not connect in the public universities. It is possible to obtain a doctorate in Arab affairs without necessarily having learned Arabic. Now, it is impossible today to survive as a scholar without access to original, contemporary, as it happens material in the language of that country. If it's an English language country, fine, no problem. But the whole world speaks a multitude of other languages. Why is it that in India, we are almost unique in not having a better connection between area studies and language? Any thoughts on that, Nayan? Are you in? Have we?
Yeah, these are very.
Yes, sir.
But before I try to address them, let me thank Ambassador Saran for mentioning that sometimes the foreign policy makers benefit from academics writing. This is a good thing to know, because academics generally feel, and certainly journalists, that they are too low in the totem pole for foreign policy mandarins to take notice of them. So the fact that their work sometimes is used by foreign policy makers, that's a very, very encouraging message. Now, before I address that, let me a little bit about my experience, because I'm kind of strange bird. I started as an academic. I studied history and then started researching on international relations. And while starting to research on Vietnam, Cambodia, I realized, I was in Calcutta, that I could not learn any of the languages. I could not learn Vietnamese, Khmer, Lao. And so I was frustrated. I said, so how can I do research in this area? And so I said, okay, at least I can learn French at Dalvaux Française. And a lot of material on Cambodia and Vietnam are available in French. And because it was an ex-colony, they still use the language. And that's how I was almost forced to choose a subject of my research where I could get material in French. And so I moved to researching on Cambodian foreign policy. And so that took me in one direction. But I have no regrets, because I really enormously enjoyed that. And having started on this academic research path, I was drawn into journalism because I had many questions that I could not get answered from the archives, from the books I have read. And it was my personal journey of inquiry which landed me as a reporter in Vietnam in 1974. So I happened to be in Saigon when the North Vietnamese tanks came in and crashed the gates of the palace. And since then, I have been following the issues of Vietnam and Cambodia and Laos. And then I also wanted to develop the ideas, information I received in course of my reporting. This could not be all told in a 600, 800 words articles in the Far Eastern Economic Review. So I wrote a book which was a kind of trade book, but based on research and interviews. And that book, I combined my own reporting and studying documents by interviewing policymakers who had taken policy barely 5, 6, 10 years ago. And I found it fascinating that most policymakers from Washington to Beijing to Hanoi, they're all willing to talk to me because I was talking about something that happened in the past, but they're interested to know how much I knew as to why they decided on certain things. And so their curiosity to know about what other fellow policymakers were thinking when they decided on certain course led me into a very interesting interaction with the policymakers themselves. So I think this is one area of study which is not purely academic, not purely reporting, but a combination of interviews, document studies, and reporting that could enlighten certain aspects of policy making that are not available either in the archives nor in the newspaper reports. So to go to your question of area studies, that is a tremendous drawback in India. As you have rightly pointed out, until very recently, the people, they all studied history of India and history of UK and maybe history of US. But for instance, Southeast Asia has been ignored completely since the time of R.C. Mukherjee and others who wrote some pioneering work on Southeast Asia.
Yes.
In independent India, there are maybe a handful of scholars who followed Southeast Asia, and yet, when the time came for India to take decisions, there is an awful shortage of experts who could actually tell the policymakers what really was happening and what perhaps could be done. So area studies is something that absolutely needs to be strengthened.
Thank you very much. I think you've brought in important elements of your personal experience as a journalist, as an academic. And that again is a set of ideas that we will be exploring a little further. Yamini, if I may turn to you and ask, what is the role that think tanks, NGOs can play in the area of policy advice? Part of the context for this is provided by the fact that our public universities tend to take the attitude that policy advice is not their responsibility, that is an area that they generally don't want to pursue. I used to hear that at JNU. I don't know if that is still the primary ethic at JNU. For sure, at the private universities, things are rather different. So if I may ask, in what ways will academic research become relevant to policy making, because you head an institution that straddles this area with great finesse and competence, thanks to the work of yourself and your distinguished professors. What about the sources? And what about your own personal experience at CPR, if I may ask? Please, Yamini.
Thank you. And first of all, a very big thank you to you, to my esteemed panelists, and to the Bridge Project for inviting me to be, and inviting the Center for Policy Research to be a co-conspirator and co-collaborator in this very important conversation. In fact, it touches at the heart of the existential question that we ask ourselves as an institution and are asked often as well, which is about this bridge literally between policy, practice and research. And we're constantly asking ourselves this question and struggling to find coherent ways of answering it. Sometimes you do things, you intuitively know that there is a logic to why you're doing it, and that almost makes it harder to articulate it to others in your community. So it's very, very helpful for us also to be pushed to think harder about precisely these questions. Let me put it this way. I think, in fact, I began my career in the NGO sector and spent a few early years flirting with social activism quite a lot, and was engaged very much at the grassroots with the romance of youth, which always makes you believe that you have the power to change the world in every way and shape how things, how the world, making the world a better place rather. And that was a very formative experience for me, because I think being at the cutting edge of where you really feel the consequences of government and trying to engage with the government at the grassroots really pushed me to get a much deeper understanding both of the limits of the Indian state and its ability and willingness to respond to the pressing needs of Indian citizens, but also as we engaged in trying to find solutions to very, very wicked problems of improving the quality of education, improving the implementation of employment programs, which are some of the work I was doing, engaging with the challenges of the right to information as well, that I was very heavily involved in some of the early years of my career. One of the things that struck me repeatedly was that there's a lot of work that we are doing on the on the ground that is trying to push the system to be responsive, and in that process, of course, we encountered many inside the state that were very keen to be responsive and to do the right thing, but would often be stymied by the complexity of the processes. Something we would hear very often: budget nahi hai, file mein nahi hai, I'm waiting for the order, I'm waiting for the authorization. And it made me feel like there's a wealth of engagement that takes place at the cutting edge that doesn't always find expression inside the system in a way that can get the system to start oiling itself to move and function. And through the course of our engagements, at the grassroots and with state government officials, repeatedly, I felt that there was a very crucial missing link. The academics, and all the research papers that we read as students and that informed the work that we were doing on the ground, presented us with a set of, with a macro understanding of the way the world should be and how to interpret the world that we see. And the experience at the grassroots gave us a very robust understanding of what was actually happening on the ground, both to verify our theoretical frameworks, but also to apply them. But there was this whole in between that was in some ways caught in the middle. And the everyday life of a bureaucrat, filled with files and papers and phone calls and buzzing around, they were searching desperately for solutions, but one sense that didn't necessarily have the luxury of thinking and applying what they learned to identifying solutions. And it was in this quest that I sort of entered the space of the think tank, precisely because in some ways it straddles both these policies context. It straddles a very deep understanding of the world of ideas. In many, many respects, it shapes the world of ideas through its research. And in fact, we have at CPR as well a very, very close relationship with the university. I mean, the university is a very central part of what legitimizes the role that we play. But at the same time, what we are trying to do is to operate as a sort of intellectual brokers, in a sense, between the world of ideas and the world of practice. So it's partly a framing role, shaping the ideas, and partly a translation role of converting those ideas into everyday practice. And what we in CPR do, which I greatly value, perhaps because of my own youthful romance, is the ability to actually take what we learn from the grassroots and what we learn from the ivory tower and bridge it together into a coherent engagement with the world of policy. So we are able to sit in committees. Government, of course, now, as you know better than anyone else, as the task of governance has become so complex, it seeks expertise in different ways and forms. And one of the ways in which it does this is by commissioning research or setting up expert committees where people who are embedded in acquiring knowledge on a certain topic participate in a conversation about how to translate that knowledge into practice. And these are the spaces that we occupy as a think tank. And where we get our legitimacy from is precisely because we are able to bridge this gap. And one more really important role that I think think tanks play in the world of ideas that's different to pure academia is that because we are in the everyday of policy making, whether at the grassroots or at the decision making level, or our engagement is at that level, we also have the ability to sometimes frame the question and try to push the envelope of how government is faced. So considers some of the very critical challenges that government faces today. India needs to grow. India needs to be green. How do you balance out the needs of being environmentally sound while at the same time growing our economy and meeting energy needs of a growing economy? How do you frame and answer that question? That's a critical role that we play as well.
Yamini, would you add a word to an issue that is critical for many of the think tanks of India? Where to get funding? Why is it that so many have their backs to the wall? I mean, what's it called? The corporate social responsibility doctrine somehow left out think tanks. Think tanks don't qualify for CSR spending. Is there in a short way, can you tell us, is there a magic formula?
If I knew the answer to that question, it would be very different, wouldn't it? I think one of the biggest frustrations, actually, that I certainly feel on a day-to-day basis is, with all the biases of having been in this institution and having the privilege of leading this institution, I sincerely believe we play such an important role in the public sphere in India. And it is deeply disappointing and frustrating that we aren't given the ability to actually get better at what we do because we don't have the kind of financial resources that we need. And I think part of the challenge is that we haven't done a good enough job as a community of being able to articulate why what we do matters so much. I think very often when we talk to corporates about the challenge of funding, they look at us and say, well, all this policy making is fine. The real story in India is about implementation and what happens on the ground. And we need to be funding people who are getting their hands dirty on the ground every day. And I think our inability to explain why it's so important. And the second thing, very crucial, is for recognizing the centrality of the objectivity of research. As in think tanks that occupy this very blurry space between ideas and policy making, it's very, very crucial for us to maintain objectivity, rigor, and a commitment to evidence and integrity in our work. And that means that we have to be very careful about how we are getting funded and who we are getting funded from.
Great.
And I think it's very important for corporate India doesn't always understand this, because in their imagination, think tanks are sort of, occupy some complex space of lobbying and otherwise. And so that's also part and parcel of a collective education that needs to be done, both on why we matter, what role we play, and how best we can be honest to the intellectual brokering role that we play, rather than the lobbying brokering role that many expect us to play.
Thank you. I think you put it extremely well. Sham, can I come back to you, please, and ask you, in terms of your learnings from diplomacy, your observations in other parts of the world, in South Asia or elsewhere, how do other countries manage these linkages that we are talking about, the gap between theory and practice? Alexander George, professor at Stanford, wrote a brilliant short monograph on bridging the gap, actually. I think that is part of the title. And he talked about how important it is for the public affairs intellectual, particularly in foreign affairs, to speak to foreign ministry officials in ways that add to the material or the information that they need, or sometimes they don't know that they need it, but which will be helpful to them, rather than talk to them about abstruse concepts. I think he used the expression, how their eyes glaze over anytime you talk to them about Aiyar theory, for example. But any thoughts on that, Shyam, in terms of your observations of the practices of others?
So I can only speak of the experience in some of the countries that I have served. Certainly in a place like Japan, when I was there, they had a very institutionalized system of being able to, have very frequent sort of interactions with the academic side. I saw this, for example, particularly in relation to Japan's relations with China. A tremendous amount of, focus on the history aspect, on the culture aspect, on what is the culture of doing business with China. So there it was far more institutionalized. It was not episodic as it is sometimes in a country like India. If I look at countries like, for example, Indonesia or Myanmar or Nepal, even less than what we see in India, frankly. I did not come across any kind of a structured kind of a engagement between the foreign affairs and the academia side. So India, in that sense, is somewhat better off than the others are. But let me also try to point out that one of the problems is what I think Yamini referred to, that if you go to a bureaucrat's office and you see a large amount of files and telephone calls and people coming in and out, where is the time to think? This is a real problem, because just the paper flow is so much, and there are crises and visits coming up and meetings coming up, delegation to delegation level meetings. So if you actually see the agenda of say a joint secretary in the Ministry of External Affairs, and you yourself have been, I'm sure, subjected to that, it is difficult to sit back and say, oh, listen, I need to think about this.
Yes.
And this is the most valuable thing that the academic side is able to provide. Something that you do not have time to do, you can benefit from somebody whose job it is to do that thinking. And I think that, yes.
Sorry. Sham, your reference to Japan triggered the recollection that it was probably around 1996, 97, when Japan took a conscious decision to engage with India in a big way, that for a period of 3 years, each year, teams of Japanese scholars, most of whom had never visited India, much less studied India, came to the country and engaged, not just in India, but across South Asia, with universities, think tanks, scholars, the media, and others, for a full year. Programs, meetings, seminars, discussions were organized for them. The first year, the focus was on political issues, the second year on economic issues, and the third year on social issues. This is how Japan prepared itself for a stronger engagement with South Asia. You remember, Sham, in the old days, Japanese used to say that for us, Asia ends at Myanmar.
Exactly.
Say that India is not really Asia in
Right.
their reckoning. All that has changed.
They would say that we are bewildered by India.
Exactly. A second example, and this I chanced upon in a conversation. In China, the topmost policy-making group on foreign affairs is called a leading small group on foreign affairs. It is headed by the president of the country, has the premier, and has 3 or 4 standing committee, Politburo members, and a spectrum of people. Its membership is secret. It's never announced. Quite by chance, I learned that an almost monthly meeting takes place between heads of think tanks and this group. I mean, imagine the topmost group of the country is accessible to think tanks. Mind you, these are official think tanks for the great part. But let me turn to Nayan Saab and ask, what about bringing in the media as a potential bridge? And it's particularly apt that this is put to you because you have not just your academic background, but your very solid media credentials as well. How do we engage the media in trying to bridge this gap? Is that at all possible? And this also connects a little bit with the very big question of speaking truth to power. That applies not only to the media, it applies in spades to civil servants, and of course it applies to academics as well. Any comments on this, sir?
Excellent questions. I think I would still go back to one of the earlier questions you raised about interdisciplinary study. This is one area where academics could really help policymakers to see things in a wider perspective. You mentioned area studies, which is good, which is focused, but it's also important to widen the focus to see things in a wider context. And interdisciplinary study is possible for academics to pursue, very difficult for foreign policy experts to devote any time. They may read once in a while this and that book, which is not our foreign policy, but they cannot afford to spend time in studying many different things. And so looking at the current pandemic, it is quite astonishing how little this understanding. This pandemic has been with us since at least 5th century BC. Thucydides wrote about the pandemic, epidemic in Athens. And since then, it has been affecting humanity. And the word quarantine, where does it come from? It comes from the Italian quarantina, 40. 40 days you were isolated.
Okay.
And this was happening in Venice in the 14th century. So you understand the historical background, you understand what is happening today. So this is the kind of interdisciplinary study which academics can pursue and perhaps inform the policymakers. Now, as to your question about journalists helping foreign policymakers, it happens all the time. In my career, 40 years, I have interviewed as top officials, but also spoken in private for their understanding of what's going on. So I hope in some small way I helped them to understand what is going on.
Sure.
And so this is, it still happens, but I think it's less and less. I think there is a lack of trust. That can you trust a journalist that if you ask him a question, he would immediately conclude that is a good story to pursue, and he'll run with it and perhaps create a more difficult situation for the policymakers. So this is just an example. So there has to be trust between the academics, the journalists, and policymakers, that we are talking about facts, and certain facts have to be off the record. These are understandings without which there cannot be any fruitful cooperation.
Thank you very much. I think you touched on a key point, the building of trust. My own personal experience, and I'm sure I speak also for Sham in this respect, that building a relationship of trust with journalists in any place where you're located abroad is one of the key tasks of diplomacy today. The connections you make, the degree of mutual confidence that you are able to establish is critical. I remember something that the great G.K. Reddy once told me. He said, people sometimes ask, how do I manage to get stories? He said, I manage to get stories because when I go to a person for information, I already know about 3/4 of the story. I worked it out. So when I then ask a question, they say, hey, you seem to know quite a lot of what's going on. So I might as well give you a little bit more of information to supplement what you already know. And this is a very charming, engaging way in which G.K. Reddy explained his remarkable ability to come up with insights and stories. But I'm sure that's been your experience as well. It has also been my experience as a researcher in Japan, when I went to the Gaimusho and talked to them about the working of the Gaimusho. The Deputy Director General who received me, he laughed and he said, nobody has ever asked these questions to me, such questions here in this building. But he said, what you say is interesting. And he was extremely open. And we spoke for an hour and a half without any reserve on his part. Yamini, can I come back to you and ask how technology can be mobilized in the process of learning? How can data, even big data, for example, be used in foreign policy making or in think tank work? You talked about the objectivity of research. This was absolutely critical. If research is not seen as objective, then it cannot get to first base. And how to make yourself accepted as credible is crucial. Whether you head a think tank, whether you're in the media, whether you are a researcher, or you're working as a diplomat. Please, Yamini.
Thank you. Let me try and answer that question by actually picking up on something that Professor Chanda also said about trust, because I really do think that that's at the heart of these relationships and at the heart of the bridge actually between research, policy and practice. And we don't talk about it enough. The core issue of trust is the following, in that the policy making community also has to be willing to trust the research and be open to what the research tells you. And I think that increasingly in the kind of politics that is unfolding across the globe, and India is not an exception, the sort of strongman politics is built on a delegitimization of the expert. And it also creates a context in which when research tells you sometimes uncomfortable truths about the facts that you would like to project to the world, negotiating that terrain becomes extremely difficult. And what inevitably happens then is that the space of policy closes off. And I think, for instance, we have seen some big arguments in India about even government's own data that is not put out in the public domain on occasion. So I think there has to be a much wider debate on the role of trust in evidence, and how then the community of stakeholders, from the journalists to the think tank to the policymaking community, engages with that. When the evidence tells you that a program or a policy you have implemented may not have met the goals or at the speed at which you would like to meet the goals that you've set out and the targets that you have set out, the answer cannot be to shut off or to discredit the data. The answer has to be able to engage in a dialogue about data. And since we are all in a world of COVID, let's, let me try and bridge it in our current context. So for instance, it's now become commonplace across the world to say the first thing that we need to do if we really have to manage this disease without lockdowns is to expand our testing capacity. But when the public discourse converts testing numbers into is state A doing better than state B? So you're taking the test, instead of it being a diagnostic, a tool that will tell you where you are, into a competitive game about whose health system is responding better, you inevitably create incentives within the policymaking community to not tell you the truth. Much as the policymaking community doesn't want to tell you the truth because it doesn't want you to shape to take the narrative out of its own hands. So this relationship of trust is not so much with the actors, but trust with the expertise, trust of evidence that our politics has sought across the globe to delegitimize. And we as actors in the space of academia, research, and policy need to find credible ways of reclaiming it. How we do that, and I think that bridges to what you were saying about the question you posed about big data and technology. I think that technology offers us huge opportunities to be able to better understand and analyze the way of the world. And I think we as a community owe it to all those we seek to engage with, and particularly to the legitimacy of expertise, to be much more careful about the interpretation of this big data. And I think that, again, COVID is a good example, as all the modeling that took place in early January, February, and March came out with frightening numbers. The way in which the community chose to articulate and interpret those numbers did create a kind of policy-making panic that had, I think, somewhat negative repercussions. So how you engage and interpret with big data and how you use data in a way that furthers the debate is very, very critical, and we as a community should be more conscious of that.
I think you've given a very, very pertinent example by bringing in COVID-19. I think we, the world, is going to have to live with COVID-19 for a long time. And it behoves on us to be as objective as we can be. And this kind of competitive number crunching or making comparisons, are we better than X or Y, is, as you rightly put it, is really confusing and not terribly helpful. We will now shift to the floor questions, the comments, questions, particularly questions from those who are listening to us. But before I shift to Tanvi, let me leave with you 2 or 3 ideas. See if you would like to reflect over these and maybe bring them into the conversation if these are pertinent from your point of view. One large issue is that of knowledge management. That is, how do we manage knowledge in a way that is effective and which helps us to again bridge this gap, this gulf between those who are in the field, those who are the policy makers, those who do research, the think tank people, and all the rest. Connected with that is also the issue of public accountability. And Yamini touched on this very, very elegantly in her remarks a few moments back. In relation to international affairs, I have this bee in my bonnet about oral histories. And I feel that oral histories is a method that is greatly underutilized in many parts of the world. At the US Library of Congress, you can actually access 1700 plus, maybe it's now 1800, oral histories of American diplomats. And these are open documents, searchable, amenable to word search, and you can pull out a trove of information. And their attitude is, of course, people will tell lies. People will exaggerate their own goals. It all eventually evens out because the researcher will figure out what is a real story and what is not. But with these few thoughts, let me turn now to Tanya, and ask Tanya, can you please put to us the first one or two questions? If you can cluster them together, that will be helpful. I will then toss the question to one of the three panelists. Tanya, you have the floor.
Yes, thank you so much for this really interesting debate on the theme. So one of our questions here from Biplab from South Asian University is, towards bridging the gap in academia and policy divide, is the lateral entry to Indian Foreign Service an important tool? And is it desirable by the foreign policy establishment?
Okay, logically, that question will have to go to Sham. I may also have a few thoughts on that. Sham, would you please come in and respond to that? Lateral entry.
I think there are many opportunities for academics to come into the Ministry of External Affairs and contribute to the work of the ministry. Ambassador Rana, you yourself have drawn attention to the fact that over the last few years, we have been, in fact, appointing consultants who come and do research on specific topics that may be of interest to the ministry. And that's to my mind, that's a very good thing. We have a problem in the Ministry of External Affairs because of the very small numbers we have. For a country of India's size and particularly its ambitions, to play a larger regional role, to play a larger global role, you can't manage that with 1,000 diplomats or 1,200 diplomats. That's simply not reasonable. So while in the long run you have to increase the numbers in the cadre, but in the short run, in the run up to that, there is no alternative but to get in people, qualified people from outside. So when I was Foreign Secretary, I had given a proposal that we could bring in people from the private sector, not only in the academic world, but even from the business world. We could bring in people for, say, 5 years, who could work maybe for 2-3 years in the ministry itself, perhaps also have a chance to go and serve in some mission abroad for a few years. And this, I thought, would be of great value to our own ministry. But unfortunately, the UPSC held the view that, this kind of lateral appointment could not be done. I believe there has been some change in that respect, but what we ended up with was taking people on deputation from other services.
Yes.
So we had, for example, people coming even from the armed forces, as you are aware. We have had people coming from the Indian Economic Service for a lot of our economic and trade related work. So the trend is, I think, in that direction.
I think there's one additional thing that is entirely doable, and that is, just as the External Affairs Ministry has taken academics, scholars in the policy planning division, it would make sense to send out to certain selected major embassies these kind of scholars who would work in embassies to make a bridge, to make a connection with the local think tanks, the research institutes, and academia in those countries. This would work in Washington, D.C., in Berlin, in Moscow, in Paris, etc. And in Beijing, and in Tokyo, and perhaps in South Korea as well. So I think these are things which are doable. Another question, please, Tanya.
Yes, so this one, I'll be combining two questions here from Major General P.K. Chakravarti from CLOS and Varun Maturkar from Jawaharlal Nehru University. So the Major General asks that there is very little time for practitioners in the research and academia to really make the information available to practitioners. So even in empowered committees, it is difficult to make them meet. So do you think there is a change of mindset that is necessary for them to be more collaborative? And can the government help to build larger capacities for greater research collaborations within the South Asian region? And if there are any recent initiatives that come to mind?
And the second question? Oh, you
yes,
combined
sir. Yes, I've combined them already.
Yamini, would you like to respond to this, please?
Sure. I think while it's true that government is very often quite busy and the demands of data that researchers have can be overwhelming and frankly not quite top priority as you're dealing with the crisis of the day. There are actually two things that could be done. One, just a lot more transparency of key data, and frankly under the right to information a lot of this is now supposedly at least mandatory, so both archival information as well as putting out data sets and key pieces of information that are necessary that would inevitably crowdsource researchers into doing a lot of analysis. So for example, one wing at the Center for Policy Research does a lot of work on government budgets, public finance management systems, and if only the government was a lot more transparent about the information that it puts out on its management information systems and websites, nobody would need to ask for specific information in a committee. It would just be available for people to do analysis, and then government can draw on that analysis as it sees fit. So one, putting out a lot, being a lot more transparent about data and making it available addresses part of the problem. The other is, I think there are now innovative models that are emerging of research partnerships within government that I think are very easily scalable. And it's coming out of a deep felt need within government of the need for engaging more with the space of ideas, research, analysis, to enable them to get better at their decision making. So, for example, one of my colleagues here at CPR occupies a research chair that is essentially a chair that is financed by a particular department, and the relationship is of deep research on the particular topic, so generating knowledge through archival work that this particular chair therefore has access to, and also providing regular research analytical support to key decision makers as part of the process. So it's like an embedded, sort of semi-embedded research position that is of great value to a researcher because you're an insider outsider, and hopefully is also of great value to government. So I think there's a lot of innovation that is going on right now in terms of sourcing ways of being able to better engage with expertise and research, which is coming out of a felt need in government, and it will find new ways of expressing itself as we go along. So the committee is not a static entity; it's evolving as it goes.
Yamini, I had worked, I'd written a paper way back in 2004 on performance management. All over the world now, foreign ministries are reporting on performance. In India, we started hesitantly with a kind of output budget of the Ministry of External Affairs. Frankly, it didn't disclose very much, but it was an effort. It was a door had opened a little bit. I think it's withered away. I don't think any output budgets have emerged since 2014 or 15, and nobody seems to pay attention to this. I mean, again, it's a question of public accountability. I never tire of saying that we really need to have a strategic plan cascaded to a second level of goals and a third level of actions. And if we have that, like the Canadians, like the Australians, the New Zealanders, the British, the Americans, we would then also be able to put out a performance output statement in terms of how our units, including embassies, are performing. Maybe that's a bridge too far.
Can I just very quickly say, I think absolutely. In fact, the Niti Aayog is sort of try to reignite this performance management and outcome budgeting framework, but it's badly designed. It's not taken particularly seriously, and there's a whole other set of reasons there. But it is definitely something that should be priority. The other thing I just wanted to very quickly add to that is the fact that actually there is, there isn't really a thinking arm within government. State governments, the planning departments have completely atrophied. We got rid of the planning commission. The Niti Aayog is not quite performing that role. At one point, an independent evaluation office was set up, but it dissipated. Most ministries, the External Affairs Ministry is unique in that at least it has a policy planning group, but most ministries don't have these mechanisms. And I think the absence of these mechanisms is part of the problem. These need to be embedded in to the everyday life of bureaucracy, certainly at the Government of India level, if not at the state government level.
Thank you. Tanya, over to you.
That was a really interesting point you made, ma'am, over there. And we have a related question to that now. Dhritiman Mukherjee, it's a he, I believe, asks, how far does the degree of engagement with think tank vary with different political regimes in India?
Nayan, would you like to come in on this? Do you have any thoughts, any observations on this? And perhaps Yamini as well, but I wonder if Nayan, you have any...
No, I cannot answer that because I have no particular knowledge of that. I think Yamini is perhaps best placed. But one answer to the question earlier asked was how to get the different ministries or experts to find information or knowledge from the academia. One thing perhaps one could consider what universities do on a regular basis is to have a Thursday brown bag lunch. So the ministry can have a system that every month, once a month or twice a month, 2 hours will be kept aside for discussing an issue with academics. And those who have the time can come and attend. Because if it is available on the building, maybe many would just drop in to see what's the thought in that particular subject is. I think that's just thought.
That's a fine idea. Yamini, any quick comment on the question that was put?
I actually think the think tank is becoming more and more important inside as an entity and a critical entity in shaping policy and public discourse. It's certainly gaining a lot more traction. I mean, if you look at, take something like the Raisina Dialogue, which is such a big, crucial event that the Ministry of External Affairs does. It's done in partnership with the Observer Research Foundation, which is a well-established think tank. So in the Vivekananda Foundation, India, in many ways, the think tank is emerging, it's sort of in the process of emerging as a central pillar of the policy-making ecosystem. But to me, the real challenge is actually comes from the particular political moment that the globe finds itself in. And I think the very deeply politically polarized public discourse that we confront results in a typifying of stereotyping of, are you left, are you right, are you center, are you with us, are you against us, who can we talk to and who can we not talk to, at the cost of an objective, rigorous, argumentation. So we have given up on argumentation, and we have given up on privileging dissent and multiplicity of opinions in favor of a very, very polarized and typifying opinions and points of view in a way that I think undermine the real value that research and think tanks can provide. And that's the space that we need to crawl back and grab back, because that's so crucial to shaping policy objectively and sensibly.
But Yamini, that is also happening a little bit because of the great paucity of funding. And therefore, funding comes from political entities that have a certain character. And an independent, autonomous research entity or a think tank faces a tough time. Tanya, next question, please.
Yes, I'll be combining two questions again. One is from Luisa Rodriguez. She is a professor at Ruia College in Mumbai. And she asks that there is a wide gap between the existing area of studies, the interdisciplinary studies, as we of policy studies. What steps can be taken to institutionalize a system that can bridge this gap? And another question from Sunita Anu is that what are the key skills needed for a person who is making a transition from academia to a think tank?
Sham, any thoughts on this? I know it's not directly connected with the work in the Ministry of External Affairs, but you're a man of very wide experience.
Well, let me say that the importance of cross-disciplinary studies is something that I have written about quite a number of times, that most of the challenges that we face today are cross-domain challenges. So if you're talking about water security, it's not only a water security issue, it is also perhaps a health security issue, it is perhaps also an energy security issue. And therefore, if you are looking at interventions in singular domains, you are missing out on what kind of a feedback loop it may have with some other domain. So today, it is very, very important that we not only look at these kind of cross-disciplinary responses, but we also design them in that manner, recognizing that cross-disciplinary nature. But let me say this, that I think Yamini will bear me out, that we are so conditioned in the manner in which we have been trained to look at issues in those similar domains. We feel much more comfortable in sort of doing the microscopic work in a single domain, and we are not very comfortable in going into some other domain. And this requires very horizontal kind of teamwork among people who are experts in different domains, to be able to look at their own dimension, but then be able to cross-check with others. This is something which even within think tanks, it is not so easy to promote. So I in fact have found that sometimes you get, because we are in the practitioners field, I find that sometimes those who are in the practitioner side, instinctively, because this is something that they face every day to day, they do perhaps much more cross-domain thinking than perhaps I find in the academic side. So this is something which on the academic side and even on think tank side, we need to sort of look into how to bring about those kind of horizontal teamwork.
Nayan, in your present role as a professor teaching international affairs, would you agree with the point that in the academic world also there is perhaps too much of tight focus on particular areas rather than broad cross-regional, cross-disciplinary approaches?
Yeah, this is a very important question. And the answer is yes. It is most often very narrowly focused. But for that, the blame really lies on this education system, because in order to get a sort of position, you have to get a PhD, and PhD subjects tend to become increasingly narrower and narrower, because without narrowing down, you will take 10 years instead of 4 years to finish your PhD. And so once you have done that PhD in a very narrow field, then also the task of your teaching often requires specializing or focusing on a narrow area. So it is very difficult to break out of that narrow boundary of your expertise and widen your field. And so fortunately, though, there is a new branch of sort of study, world history, where people are actually looking at cross-border history, and not only his political history, but economic, social, cultural history, and giving a much broader perspective, which is very important. But that is still a very small field.
Yes.
Traditional studies are all very narrowly focused.
Well, completely by chance, I discovered in Pune that there was, in fact, this month to be a conference on big history. I didn't even know that there was an animal called big history, but apparently this is a world congress that was to be held, which has unfortunately been overtaken by COVID-19, but it will meet at some point or the other. I think there is a commitment that they would meet in India. Tanya, would you go to a next question, please?
Yes, sir. And
Yamini might also like to think over these recent points. Yes, Tanya.
So this will be the last question for the evening. And I think this is for the benefit of all the students who have joined us today. It is posed by Ashwat Komath from South Asian University. And the question is, what are some of the themes of interest to the Indian foreign policy apparatus? And what are some of the frequently referred sources for Indian diplomats and policymakers?
Sham, would you like to take this? Because I'm a little shocked by this. I'm not sure if there are any special sources that are used by MEAwalas.
Special sources in terms of academic sources, or special sources in terms of we have we have lots of sources. I mean, that's not the problem. Sometimes if you are in the foreign ministry, there is sometimes even an information overload. You are getting dispatches from your from various missions. You are getting news from the television channel, from the newspapers, from magazines. You have your engagement with other diplomats. You have material which is produced in-house. So there is a lot of information flow which is taking place. But information does not necessarily mean wisdom. And it is on the wisdom aspect that you need reflection. You need to be able to step back and see what that information means. Unfortunately, the focus is very much on information. For example, intelligence agencies enjoy a high status because they are constantly feeding you with information which is stamped secret, and therefore it is valuable, or so they think. But this is a problem in terms of valuing information more than, as I said, wisdom. And this is why I come back again to what I said in the beginning, that you need to be able to have perhaps some institutionalized form of engagement between those whose job it is to reflect and those whose job it is to act. When you have both of them coming together, and in the manner that Ambassador Rana himself has mentioned, is something which is par for the course. If you go to Australia or to Japan or to China even, this is something which is not left to chance. It is not episodic. It is something which is structured in their manner of functioning, and that is what I think needs to be brought into the Indian system as well. We do it, but we don't do it in a proper structured way, and therefore we don't derive the maximum benefit out of it.
I think I would greatly endorse what Sham has just said. Uh, One of our big challenges is how to institutionalize arrangements. This operates at many levels. For example, I've heard from those who have held the high office of foreign secretary how particular foreign secretaries established their own informal mechanism for periodic high-level consultation with counterparts, the defense secretary, the home secretary, the finance secretary, the commerce secretary, the economic affairs secretary. But these are not institutionalized, and that is at the heart of our challenge. Similarly, Nayan mentioned the idea of a brown bag lunch, an informal gathering space where people can come, meet, exchange ideas. Sometimes you may have a theme for a discussion. Way back in 2009 and 10, for 2 successive years, the Ministry of External Affairs organized conferences where academics were brought in. The first was focused on public diplomacy, and the second one was on international affairs. But both the conferences had a range of themes that were covered. And I absolutely don't understand why that practice of an annual conference held in Delhi with academics was given up. Today, one of the virtues, one of the lessons of COVID-19 is that we are all going to use the virtual space much more regularly and perhaps proficiently. And even the face-to-face conferences, when they return in full flow, and God knows when that might be, there will be a parallel virtual platform that will also perhaps operate. Be it the Raisina dialogue, be it other conferences, other events. These are all important practices where an interchange of ideas, a flow of information takes place. I am particularly struck by the fact that young people, students, young scholars, young researchers have in their minds a number of questions, a number of issues that they would like to address, which perhaps they feel don't come up sufficiently. For example, I know that the External Affairs Ministry started a program of internships. I honestly don't know where it has gone. I don't know whether it continues or not. At the Institute of Chinese Studies, we have embarked on a program of virtual internships. The US State Department has a robust program of virtual internships. And this is nothing to do with the pandemic. This is several years old. So it is quite easy for an institution to really have virtual interns. At the Institute of Chinese Studies, I spoke about this for 5 years. It took a pandemic for people to realize that actually it can be done. I don't know if you do it at CPR, if you have a regular ongoing program of virtual internships, because it gives a young scholar sitting far away in Seoul or in Cairo or wherever a connection that here is a group of people with whom I can be engaged. And these are things that are truly worth doing. But I don't want to go on for too long. If there are no other questions, Tanya, then I will now, perhaps in reverse order, request Yamini, then Nayan, and then Sham to give final observations, thoughts, comments that they may have, things that they wanted to say but didn't get a chance to say, and perhaps also respond a little bit to my question about knowledge management, use of oral histories, and making essentially the bridge between policy and practice in different fields. Yamini, with you, we'll start and then go to Nayan and then to Sham. Please.
Thanks. I thought I'll pick up on the multidisciplinary issue for a moment and just offer two comments. I think, part of, as Ambassador Saran rightly said, it's disciplinary silos lock you in certain ways that make it very difficult even for institutions, think tanks that are multidisciplinary like ours, to actually allow for that kind of cross thinking and cross-fertilization of ideas, which is actually so crucial, and because whenever it's done, one realizes the power of it. But I think a lot of this also needs to go back to the challenge of public policy as a discipline itself. I think it's still evolving as a discipline. I am a student of multidisciplinary work, and I actually found the biggest flaw in the way in which I was taught was the absence of a core disciplinary anchor from which you could apply a multidisciplinary lens. And for me, being a practitioner was really what I think helped me anchor myself in before I was able to engage more in the space of research. So I think there's a very big space of engagement and thinking that needs to be done in terms of public policy as a discipline. Increasingly, I find across the globe, and particularly in India, public policy is becoming public policy degrees are becoming quite popular, and a large number of people, young students are going, many I suspect on this a group here too are probably thinking of, if not already doing, public policy degrees. And I think the challenge that we need to, as participants in this academic work, in the academia, is to really think a lot harder about what makes for a good public policy discipline that brings to the table the best of interdisciplinary thinking, but also the discipline of a core discipline. And I think we often lose that when we talk about multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary work. The second thing I just wanted to add in is that, in fact, I think there is now a very interesting evolution of internships and other ways in which young people can engage with the practice of policymaking, particularly in government. Across the country, when I go to meet with state governments, I see lots of young people who are not formally part of the Indian administration coming in on fellowships. There are chief minister's fellowships, there's prime minister fellowships, there's Niti Aayog fellowships, there's good governance fellowships. There are very interesting ways in which people are embedding themselves in. And I think that those opportunities, I'm green with envy. If they existed when I was young, it would have really been a learning for me. So grab them when you see them. But I think, again, we have to think a lot harder about how you institutionalize these into career management inside government as well as outside. And that thinking is still not being done. And it needs to be better structured. And that will also help address what you asked, Ambassador Rana, about building knowledge systems and ensuring that there is a much wider interplay across the ecosystem of knowledge creation and knowledge management, which is, I think, what is needed to finally bridge this gap.
Thank you very much. Nayan sir?
I teach a course on Southeast Asia and China, and also another course on globalization. And at least for my Southeast Asia China course, I have tried to get foreign policy experts like Sham to come and speak to my class. And our international relations department at Ashoka University actually holds almost weekly meetings with foreign speakers, foreign meaning outside the university, coming and speaking. Now, this post-COVID situation has created a new opportunity, I think, that it's a question of organizing it so that we can actually expand those meetings to make it international. If, say, for instance, the Department of History in the University of Cairo or University of Paris wants to take part in a discussion on a certain issue, which will be announced a month ahead, and this is entirely not possible. And perhaps this is an opportunity that universities and think tanks should grab to actually organize, expand the scope of this meeting and sharing of knowledge and experience, global, not just interdisciplinary or inter-university, but global. That's my statement.
Thank you. I think you made a very powerful point, which implicitly also takes note of the fact that one of the benefits of the pandemic is that we are now going to use the virtual space much more to connect across the board all over without having to make a 45 or 50-kilometer journey to Ashoka University or Jindal University. Thank you very much. Sham, would you like to come in with any observations, comments?
I just wanted to perhaps just give a sense of one's learning from having served in the bureaucracy. Yamini raised the issue of public policy, and I think it is very important because sometimes, of course, as you mentioned, the Ministry of External Affairs or some other ministry will commission a study. Sometimes you have international organizations like the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank. They carry out very, very focused kind of studies, very well researched, lots of data, and yet nothing happens. So somehow there is an assumption that the quality of the research done, the comprehensiveness of the paper produced, and the compelling nature of the arguments, it should automatically translate into action because, it is so self-evident. It is usually not very self-evident. We have any number of reports which have been made and which are lying on the shelf. Sometimes, let me say, governments use this in order to avoid taking decisions. Mm-hmm. So I think we have to be also conscious of that. There are committees which are formed to thrash out some issue. The idea is not that the committee actually helps you solve the problem. The idea is that the committee just delays your having to take a decision. Now, if that is sometimes the case, how do you ensure that that doesn't happen? And this is where I think when you are doing even as an academic, when you are doing these reports, you should also be thinking about how politics around it will work. What is the political economy within which the recommendations that you are making, the points that you are making are going to be somehow considered and implemented? Because they will be like, to give you an example, if you look at the series of declarations at the summit level of the South Asia Association for Regional Cooperation, frankly, I mean, it's like a mandate for the most ambitious economic integration in the region, and yet nothing happens. Why don't things happen? I think that also is a very important subject for research. Why does it not happen? And if you therefore wanted recommendations, wanted the kind of studies you have done, research you have done, to actually make a difference in terms of implementation, that political economy aspect is critical. If you do not address that, don't be surprised if the very best work that you have done, then somebody receives it, says very interesting indeed, and then puts it on the shelf. So in those terms, public policy is actually is a very, very important ingredient in terms of the academic work that we do. Thank you.
Sham, you touch upon an issue that is very close to me. The fact that we have a rather substantial instability of actions. Actions are perceived to be linked to individuals and not to the system. Very few people will remember sometime in the early 2000s, a particular foreign minister, the Minister of External Affairs, set up a committee on economic diplomacy. It was a very rare gesture because MEA very, very seldom publicly looks at an issue like this. And it was announced that the report will be out in 2 months. Of course, nothing ever happens in 2 months. But this process went on quite a long way. And at one stage, two major internationally renowned consultancy companies came into the act. This was perhaps in month 5 or 6, and each produced a learned report. I was informally consulted by one of these two, and I tried to put in my ideas, and I think I have somewhere a copy of the document that they submitted to MEA. I heard that MEA preferred to another document prepared by another major consultancy company, which is fine. I mean, it really didn't matter. But just then, there was a change there was a reshuffle of the cabinet, and the minister left. That particular minister, a new one came in, and that was the end of the story. Now, 6 months of effort, a real process of engaging with major consultancy organizations on an issue which is of pretty major importance to India. But it all went down the tube. Now, very recently, there was, in fact, a document published probably in November or December 2019 on giving a stimulus to India's exports. It's a document that runs, it's a committee. The report runs to 120, 140 pages. And there is no mention in the report of the work done by Indian commercial offices located abroad. Now, in the area of export promotion, which is so crucial to India, it has been crucial to India for donkey's years, and it's crucial in the last 8 or 9 years when India's exports have really stagnated. And I think part of the issue is that we have not really mobilized, incentivized, operationalized our commercial offices abroad, because seeking out new markets, avenues for new products has to be a major activity carried out on the ground, but it's not done. Now, these are, you may say, oh, that's how we work, but it's a huge tragedy. We can work better. We have the capacities, we have the competences, but we don't organize ourselves better. This is something that bothers me. It has bothered me for a long time, and I write about it, and in the process lose the few friends I have, because I think these are not stories that people really want to hear, but that's life. So we are exactly at 17:30. Yamini, that is the time that you had set for us, when that's your Cinderella hour, when you have to leave. So thank you very much, Yamini. It's the first time that I meet you, and I meet you not only as Dr. Yamini Aiyar, but as the daughter of a very, very valued Foreign Service colleague. And thank you very much for all the insights you provided.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, and thank you to the Bridge Project for such an important conversation. It's been a real privilege for CPR to also partner on this. Thank you all.
Nayan Saab, I see your chair is vacant, but I'm sure you will hear us. Thank you very much for joining this. You brought to us insights not only from the world of academia, but the media. And that really is a powerful connection that we always need to establish, to cover. Sham bhai, what can I say to you? I mean, we have known each other in so many ways, in so many incarnations and encounters, that I am in awe of all that you have done, all that you have achieved, and the great contributions that you continue to make. Thank you very much for joining this.
Thank you. It's been a privilege. Thank you.
And finally, but last but not the least, my thanks to Tanvi, who will have the last word, because it is, after all, a Bridge Project activity. My thanks to Carl, to Tanvi, and the entire team at the Bridge Project for the exemplary way in which they have cooperated with all of us in organizing this event. Thank you very much to all the participants, and thank you very much again to the Bridge Project. Tanvi, you have the floor.
So
Yeah.
for the participants, thank you so much for posing your questions to us. It was indeed wonderful hearing from this lovely set of panel about their really thought-provoking responses to these questions. Now, as we conclude, I would like to take this opportunity to thank Center for Policy Research for agreeing to collaborate with us on this webinar. A special thanks to Ambassador Rana, who kindly offered to moderate the discussion and for supporting us along the way. Thank you, Ambassador Saran, Nayan, Chanda, and Ms. Aiyar for taking out the time out of your busy schedules and engaging with this audience. And finally, we thank all our participants for joining us this Saturday evening. And we look forward to hosting more such insightful and invigorating debates. Stay tuned to the Bridge Project's coming initiatives and podcast episodes. And do not forget to follow us on our social media channels. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.